Right out of school, I started out of high school as, by reading a book called Rockets, Missiles, and Guided Missiles. And from that time on, I always wanted to work on rockets. So when I went to college, got a degree in aeronautical engineering, my first job was to go to work for the company that at that time had the most powerful rocket in the world, the Atlas ICBM. I was there for several years. My job was a weights engineer. Weight is critical in any aerospace vehicle, airplanes, particularly space vehicles. One day somebody came around and said, we want you to work with the advanced design people on a special project, probably because I was sleeping at my desk. I don't know why they picked me for some reason or other. So I went down to meet people, and it turns out it was on a feasibility study for Apollo. And I'll talk a little bit about that, what that was. So I spent the first several months doing the weight studies for the feasibility of an Apollo spacecraft. Then, after that was awarded, there was a contract to build it. By that time, the powers to be for the company I worked on, General Dynamics, decided that NASA was really serious about this and descended on our small group with about 20 people, which we didn't need. We're more trouble than they were worth at the time. And we also worked on a proposal to build the Apollo spacecraft. I'll show you pictures of those and what those looked like because they're somewhat unique. Most of my colleagues I worked with at General Dynamics when we were working on the advanced design, the feasibility study, and the proposal, went to work for NASA. At that time, it was at Langley for the Space Task Group. And I decided to stay in California, mostly like, Jimmy Buffett said in Margaritaville, there must be a woman involved. Obviously there was. Turned out she'd be my wife. Anyway, I was only there 6 months because my friends came in from Houston. By that time they'd moved to Houston, to the new Manned Spacecraft Center. And I vaguely remember having dinner and several drinks with them, signing something, and I ended up in Houston, Texas. So that started my career. Once again, I was a weights engineer for what was known as the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office. Now, I'm not an astronaut. I'm not a flight controller. I worked for the organization that was responsible for the design, the development, test, and engineering of the Apollo spacecraft. It started out with the command service module, and we inherited the lunar module. All the direction, everything that had to do with building that spacecraft had to come through the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office. And that was my first job. And I was the weights engineer assigned to do that. That's why they brought me in. Now, Apollo was a unique animal, and I'll go through a little bit of that on what that was and why it was that way, because it's very misunderstood. I spent a short amount of time as the weights engineer. My first job was to design the spacecraft interior so that we could place all the equipment such that you got an offset CG. You had to have an offset CG of about 6 inches in order to fly the vehicle. Now, some people here have showed you that. In order to do that, that's how you got a small amount of lift. So I'm placing equipment that I know about with the weights I know about in various spots in order to get the offset CG. Well, one of the big problems was the astronauts. I mean, you got a bunch of 3 astronauts with fat asses sitting there right in the middle of the spacecraft. Doesn't help the CG any. So I would have liked to have flown ham. It didn't make a lot, it would have helped a lot. But, you know, so we had to work that. So that went on for quite a while. And oddly enough, in Apollo, it's an engineering project. Keep that in mind. It was never intended to be a science project. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So when I was placing items in the lower equipment bay to get the offset CG, I never even thought about providing a slot to put lunar rocks in that we were going to bring back. Just didn't occur to anybody at the time we needed to do that. Did pop up later on, and we did put a slot in there for it to help. I was only a weights engineer for a while. Then they assigned me to the project engineering office, and I always seem to get assigned to projects and to assign to spacecraft where the existing project engineer was not getting along with either the contractor or the astronauts. So I ended up in that job. The first one was boilerplate 14. It was a systems test bed where we could test all the systems with the ground support and see how everything functioned. And that went on for several years. And I found that we squeezed enough out of it. There was no reason in continuing it. Suggested we cancel it. They canceled it to save the money. And I was reassigned to my first space flight vehicle. That was a boilerplate vehicle on boilerplate 15. It's called boilerplate 15. It tested the sides, the aerodynamics. It tested the launch escape system, boosted by a Saturn I. So that was, the next one was, I was privileged to have been 5 different vehicles. The second one, that was boilerplate 15. The third one was a manned thermal vacuum vehicle, a Block 2 vehicle, a lunar configured vehicle that was in the thermal vacuum chamber at Houston, Texas. And that one was somewhat unique. It did have a crew. They were in there. We tested them for 14 days. And it was an interesting, very, very interesting test. What it did was essentially certify Apollo 1 for flight, because everything worked fine on that vehicle. Well, it had some problems, but nothing serious. It essentially qualified Apollo 1 for flight. After that, after the Apollo 1 fire, I was assigned to the first spacecraft that would be manned after the incident on the launch pad that killed 3 astronauts. We took a spacecraft that was essentially completely finished and stripped it down to the core and rebuilt it to a Block 2 vehicle and flew it as Apollo 7. Now, you get a little confused about the numbering system. Apollo 1 was named Apollo 1 because Gus Grissom wanted to be number 1. It should have been number 4. Then there was the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. So, but he wanted to be number 1, so NASA said, okay, you're number 1. So it became Apollo 1. So what I'm going to do a little bit after that, I was, as a result of Apollo 7, it was considered an ultra successful vehicle, more so than anyone could have ever realized out of a first article. And it was the vehicle that allowed us to do Apollo 8. I'll talk a little bit about that too. But after that, my award for doing such a good job on Apollo 7 was to be awarded a scholarship to go to any business school I wanted to in the United States, since NASA at the time decided it would be nice to have some engineers with some engineering background in the business side of the house and for the future. So I was there. I went to Columbia University to get my MBA. So I was in Manhattan, living in Manhattan, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. And I remember it very well because it was a rainy night. It was raining like heck in New York, and they had set up a screen in Sheep's Meadow in Central Park, and it was full of people. You don't associate New Yorkers with that kind of thing. They were sitting there in the rain watching it. I was sitting in my apartment watching it on black and white TV. So I was also there during the ticker tape parade, which is always kind of neat if I want to be up to your knees in paper, wandering around. It's kind of fun. Went back to NASA, and after that was assigned to Apollo 17. Apollo 17 was a lot different. Apollo 7, I was very close to the astronauts and the people that did it because it was so unique and it was the first article. By the time Apollo 17 rolled around, flights were really routine, so it was kind of an easy job, basically. And after that, I worked on Skylab. I spent about, somewhere after Skylab, and I don't remember the dates, I decided basic greed and avarice caught up with me, and I decided I would leave NASA to go try and make some real money, and joined a venture capital firm. Was with them for about 5 years. And I'd like to say it was not the most successful thing in the world. I was putting together what I considered to be the mother of all mergers. It was an interesting merger. It was a merger between Carter Cawley Hale stores, Mary Kay Cosmetics, Fuller Brush, and W.R. Grace into an organization called Hale Mary Fuller Grace. Well, and they didn't kind of like that, so they were not enamored with that. I thought it was really neat personally, but so that was my short time in the venture capital business. The space program, especially the manned program, just draws you in like a magnet. So I went back to the space program, worked on the space shuttle, the orbiter, the payloads world, and the International Space Station, and retired in 1997, and I now live in Las Vegas. It's always nice to live in a place where you can get a pastrami sandwich at 4 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, there's something about that. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is give you a little bit different perspective, and I'll zip through some of this because of time allowing. What you see most of the time, and you've seen it already all week, you're going to see the same thing. You're going to see the astronauts coming out of the ONC building, getting into a command module, that perfect one that dropped from heaven somehow and got there. They got into it, they flew Saturn V, and Saturn V is a magnificent vehicle. You cannot appreciate it watching it on television. You have to really be there. The roar is tremendous. The sight just lights up the whole world. The ground shakes. You can feel your heart thumping and you can feel the shock wave. That's the real way to appreciate it. So you don't really get the effect on television, but you can see it. It's pretty neat. So I'm going to present some of the things it took to really build the spacecraft. Now, at the time that we were looking at building the Apollo spacecraft, I'll put it as bluntly as I can, we did not know a damn thing about near-Earth space or deep space. We were really ignorant. We had never flown much of anything, and so everything we did, you had to start from scratch. And most of it was all developed from start to finish. I like to say we did it by looking at what we call WAGs, wild-ass guesses, and SWAGs, scientific wild-ass guesses. You know, that's how we built it, because we knew nothing, essentially. But there were a total of something like about 400,000 people worked on Apollo at various jobs spread all over the United States. And astronauts and flight controllers were just a small part of that. So let me answer one question I get all the time right off the bat. Did I want to fly on Apollo? And my answer is categorically no, for the simple reason that I don't have enough courage to sit on top of a booster that's got the explosive capability of a small atomic bomb built by the low bidder. And I just can't handle that. That takes an astronaut with the real right stuff, and that's what they did. So, but the astronauts never forgot those 400 people. They knew that their lives depended on them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it took to build that spacecraft. So let me start first of all by putting Apollo in the proper perspective. Just what did it take to get to the moon? Well, first of all, for any large program, and Apollo was certainly one of the largest the United States ever undertook, you needed 3 things. And without these 3 things, it would have never happened. First of all, you had to have the technology. State-of-the-art technology was basically the way most projects are done, but with Apollo, the technology was different. There was not a lot of state-of-the-art. The technology we proposed was that we knew what we needed in technology. We didn't have it. We knew what we needed, and everybody had confidence we could do that. So that was a little bit different in one of that concepts. We also had to have the resources. Resources, obviously, dollars and people. It was known right from the beginning it was going to be a very expensive program, one of the most expensive the United States had ever taken on, and that it was going to take a special set of skills in various areas to do it. Now, Apollo was unique in the way it obtained its skills, and when I talk about NASA, I'll point that out for a minute. But the most important thing you need, and I'll cover it as I end up, is you have to have the will to do it. First of all, you have to have a commitment to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And that's what's usually lacking in most government programs. Apollo had the will to do it, and so that's why we were basically successful. But Apollo was a victim of the Cold War. There's no doubt about that. The events that caused it to be a program was, first of all, Sputnik. And I'll talk a little bit about Sputnik. It orbited in 1957, and the manned flight of Yuri Gagarin. And by this time, Eisenhower was out, Kennedy was the new president, and he inherited another big problem, the Bay of Pigs. Between those three, he was in big trouble. And so that's a little bit about how it came about. I'll get into that. Well, if you got to step back a ways when you look at what created Apollo. It didn't start basically with Sputnik. It got its start basically in 1955 at an international, an IGY, International Geophysical Year meeting, in which the United States announced that they were going to launch a small Earth satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year, and that was supposed to happen between 1957 and 1958. Eisenhower made that statement, but what was involved in that statement, which didn't become known until many years later, there was a reason for doing that. And the reason for doing that had nothing to do with manned flight. It had to do with establishing the principle in international law of the freedom of space. In international law at that time, the air above a country was considered sovereign country. So if you flew into their country, even a few hundred miles up, it was considered an act of war. So you had to redefine the freedom of space. And the reason Eisenhower wanted to do that was because we were having a terrible time getting any information on what was going on in the Soviet Union with regard to a missile gap and a space gap. He needed that information, and Eisenhower, being a military man, recognized it. And that was the reason for doing it. The IGY was a respectable way and a legitimate cover for the United States to initiate its spy satellite program. And a few days after Eisenhower announced that, the Soviet Union announced that they were also going to fly for the International Geophysical Year. They were also going to launch an Earth satellite. Of course, everybody considered the Russians being nothing but a third world country. They'd never be able to do it. So it didn't take them too seriously. Well, on October 5th, 1957, they did it. And they did it in a very unique way. The Sputnik was just a 22.5-inch ball. It had nothing but 2 radios in it to beep, to let you know they were there, plus the booster that put it there. It was done very, very quickly. It was never the original satellite the Russians planned to fly. They really planned to fly a scientific satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year. But a few weeks before their launch, in one of the presentations that were made by an American somewhere, someone made a comment about how they were going to launch a satellite. The United States was going to launch a satellite. And this sent them into a panic. They did not want to be, they had to be first. So they threw together this 184-pound aluminum sphere with 2 radios and flew it. And nobody knew the difference, so they did it. But by doing that, the United States got exactly what they wanted. The freedom of overflight, and the American spy satellite system, which they were experimenting with at the time, got us go-ahead. It started going after that. From then on, spy satellites were the thing. Well, the other thing that happened after Sputnik was NASA there had to be an organization created to respond to it. It's kind of interesting about Apollo and Sputnik in that the headlines you saw all the time with Sputnik really were created by the media. They went into a frenzy. It was a panic on their part. A lot of them didn't understand what it was all about, but they created a terrible panic. There were some studies done, some polling done afterwards that really showed that the American public weren't that concerned about Sputnik. Eisenhower couldn't have cared less. He knew what it was. And by that time, he'd been looking at spy satellites anyway and got what he wanted, and the U-2 was flying. So he thought, he didn't think anything had to be done, but the media went crazy and the pressure was too great, so they decided they had to create an agency that would respond to this threat. And it was referred to as a space race at the time. So Eisenhower, in 1958, created the National Aeronautics and Space Act, and it inaugurated NASA. And there's no doubt that it was driven by the space race and the Cold War. That's what got us started. But it wasn't that easy to do. There was a really in-house protracted debate with the military. Eisenhower wanted it as a civilian agency. The military wanted to keep it as military. Eisenhower won. It became a civilian agency. And the way it started, it absorbed the NACA, the Aeronautics Commission for Aeronautics, which included a Space Task Group that was studying Apollo, a lunar landing. NASA officially began operations by absorbing three centers: Langley in Virginia, Lewis in Cleveland, Ohio, and Ames out in San Francisco. That was the basic start of it. Ultimately, it absorbed three more organizations: the Space Science Group of the Naval Research Lab in somewhere in Virginia, but it ended up being the core of what's known now as the Goddard Space Flight Center. We inherited the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, which later became the Marshall Space Flight Center. That was von Braun. This was the first time in von Braun's entire career he had ever worked for a civilian agency. He'd always worked for the military, so this was new to him. Well, the Apollo workforce was kind of unique. It's an interesting force. It was a new generation of engineers, and it was a major accomplishment for what they like to refer to as the American middle class. NASA's leadership was recruited basically from two cohorts: those who came to NASA from the NACA at Langley, which is a space task group basically, and those joining the agency during the time when NASA started its buildup. And from that nucleus of the NACA, about 8,000 people, it started to build up, and it peaked out at 33,000 people in 1967. A lot of those people had joined NASA at the time, like me. I joined in 1962. Ended up staying there for most of their career. We became known as the Apollo generation. But the critical mass of that arrived about 1966. Now, there's a very unique thing in the legislation that created NASA, that enabled NASA to build up the way it wanted to. There's no requirement for a civil service exam to join NASA. That was unique. NASA had the authority. If it found you and you had an expertise, it could hire you right away. I had an expertise in weight control. They hired me just like that, okay, and hired me at a high GS grade, which was also unheard of. They can do a lot of things. So that's how they built up such a great technical team. They had the capable of going after anybody they wanted, and it was easy to do. And they had the budget resources to do it. And somewhere along the line, it was determined that the Space Task Group was getting too big. They had to have their own facility. They decided to move them to Houston, Texas, to what became known as the Manned Spacecraft Center. So let me answer another question I get all the time. Why did Lyndon Johnson influence it? Obviously, the senator from Texas, when we moved to Texas. And that's not really why it got there. It got there because it was located centrally. It worked out very well. And there was we wanted good facilities to go back and forth, east and west, north and south, and Houston had those facilities. They also offered us some very prime property in a very interesting deal. But the real reason was the chairman of the budget committee, which was their need for money, was Albert Thomas. He happened to be from Houston, Texas. That's how it ended up in Houston, Texas, basically, besides all the other features it had. And it ended up getting, if you've ever been down there, the 600 acres we're sitting on, in a unique way. It's sitting on what's known as the Humble oil field. Belonged to Humble Oil, later Exxon. But being the United States government, Humble Oil couldn't give the United States government 600 acres. That just looked too fishy. So what they did, Houston was very clever about it. Humble Oil donated 600 acres of prime property on the Humble oil field to Rice University. And they got a nice tax write-off for the contribution. Rice University donated it right back to the government, to NASA, and that's how we got the 600 acres. Okay, so we ultimately, through an interesting financial deal, ended up with 600 really nice acres down there. But about 75% of the people NASA hired were basically engineers, technical people. Science, NASA was not a science project. When this project was created, it had a lot of controversy, and I'll get into that in a minute when we talk about how it got started. Let me go back for a minute and show you a little bit about the feasibility study. It started by the Space Task Group, and the Space Task Group was led by a man by the name of Robert Gilruth, who was been in the NECA for a long time. He became the director of the Manned Spacecraft Center and was there all those times. You will rarely ever hear Robert Gilruth's name. You see him every once in a while. He'll be in the background behind Gene Kranz. He was the director of the Manned Spacecraft Center all during the Apollo times. He detested publicity. It was a very rare time when you ever saw Robert Gilruth go out and give a speech, so you don't hear his name kicked around too much. The other name you don't hear kicked around too much is the chief designer for the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev. He's an anonymous man also, but not so much the same way as Gilruth. He was anonymous because the Russians were sure if they ever let him do a public talk, the United States would kill him. And that's the usual Russian paranoia. And so he never published anything. You rarely ever saw him. Once in a while, you'll see somebody in the movies that look like him, but he was the other guy. The one everybody hears about, and the guy that was out in press all the time, is obvious, Wernher von Braun. He was the front runner for all of this. So we started an RFP for an Apollo feasibility study. 88 firms responded, got a bidding package. 14 bids were submitted, and out of that, Space Task Group selected 3 contractors to run feasibility studies. The 3 contractors were Martin out of Baltimore, General Electric out of Philadelphia, Convair Astronautics out of San Diego, and they were awarded $250,000 each to do the study. Obviously, that wasn't going to do it. All of them overran it by a heck of a lot. And in addition to that, the Space Task Group, because they're a bunch of in-house NASA, NACA people, decided they would also do their own study. So there was a 4th one really done. And in May of 1961, we completed the feasibility study and submitted it to NASA. And there was a lunar task group that said Apollo would be no problem. It's kind of I don't know where they got this, no major technological breakthroughs, no crash program, and no physiological barriers were envisioned by this report. All of that never was true. But this is what my part of it, the General Dynamics study for the feasibility study, looked like. That's the one. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Go back one. The one on the right is, if you'll notice on both of these, there's no landing gear. The RFPs for both of these never specify landing because the Spacecraft Task Group had no idea how we were going to land. They didn't even know what to ask for. It was never in the proposal. It was just left as a phase 3. We'll get around to it later. So it's basically a proposal for the command service module, and that's what they looked like for both of them. They were interesting in that every one of the contractors, the 3 contractors, actually there were 5 contractors, proposed bidding to build the Apollo spacecraft. None of them proposed a command module like you ultimately ended up seeing. Everyone used what they call the re-entry vehicle with lifting capability, which they thought was better, except for the Space Task Group. They wanted to use the blunt body, and that's what they did. Well, in 1961, we got the next shock. That was Yuri Gagarin. manned space from Russia. And that was a very large spacecraft, Vostok, and it also had a very big booster behind it, so the Russians released the weight of it, which scared the hell out of everybody, especially the military, because it was now from just looking at the weight capability that they put in orbit, it was obvious the Russians now had a capability of launching an ICBM with a hydrogen bomb on it. And the reason they did that is the Russians never, up to this point, had micro-miniaturized nuclear weapons. The United States had done it. So we had relatively small ICBMs. The Russians had big ones, and I mean big. The R-7 that put that up was a booster that had 32 rockets in the first stage. And that isn't easy to control. We used to call it clusters last stand. Yeah, it was a mess. It took them a long time to do it, but it was their ICBM. Right after that, a few days later, was Alan Shepard's flight. So to compare the two, first of all, a funny comparison. Gagarin went into orbit, he made one orbit. Alan Shepard did one, it was a suborbital flight, all of 15 minutes. But the difference was Alan Shepard controlled the spacecraft. Gagarin did not. It was ground controlled. Gagarin was basically a passenger. Shepard was a pilot. Gagarin also, to come down, parachuted out of the spacecraft. And we didn't know this for a long time. But later on it became known, and most of the manned stuff, they parachuted out. Even the woman that flew in space, Valentina Tereshkova, was a parachutist. It was her hobby. That's why they put her up, because there was no problem with her bailing out. She knew how to do it. So that was what the big difference. So the time between April 12th and April 19th in 1961 was not a good time for Kennedy. He had first the Sputnik, he inherited that from Eisenhower. Then he got Gagarin in Earth orbit. The Bay of Pigs just went to hell in a handbasket. So JFK had to do something. He needed some response. Well, the political stage for Kennedy's speech, let me go talk about it a little bit. You see it all the time. It's the basic thing. You hear him talk about it all the time. You'll see it in every movie on Apollo you see. He set the lunar initiative, okay? And it was after Sputnik, and there was a Sputnik 2, I didn't cover it. LBJ had urged the senators to match the Soviets, to get into a space race with them. And he used the term, and this is a quote, control of space means control of the world. That was the argument he used with Senate. So they were kind of spring-loaded to go along with this. Jay inherited, like I say, a shaky space program and an even shakier Cuba plan. He got bad advice on the invasion of Cuba, and even worse advice in abandoning the rebels. So he was having a bad time. So he decided he had to do something. What he did is he started out by sending a memo to Lyndon Johnson, asking him to create a committee that would look at and give him recommendations on what they could do to match the Soviets. In the meantime, JFK called Bob Gilruth in Houston, and Gilruth told him that if you're going to match one for one with the Soviets, you've got to start at the same base. The starting line has to be the same. And if you're going to have a race, it's got to have a finish line. And if you do that, you start at the same time as the Soviets, you will win. That's the only way. Well, LBJ's committee basically came up with the same thing. You've got to do this. So the United States initiated a space race. JFK made it a race. It now had a finish line, the lunar landing and return, and it had to be men doing it. Couldn't be a robot. That was clear in the speech. And you had to also do it by a specific date. Now you were in a real race. One-upsmanship didn't make any difference. What was important was me crossing the finish line. And we had defined the finish line. So the famous JFK speech, as you know, happened on May 25th, 1961. And at that time, the United States had all of 15 minutes in space. And those of us that heard it says, is he crazy? We hadn't heard all the background that went into it. So we had no idea how we were going to go to the moon at the time. And he's created this program. Uh, Look at the dates. 34 days after he proposed this, Congress unanimously approved it, almost unanimously. The vote was 354 to 59, an almost unheard of vote. It was so unanimous they didn't even record it, they just raised their hand. And you could see it was unanimous, and they just counted noses, and that was it, just like that. And in July, he signed the bill that basically created the crash program. And there was no more one option. We had a finish line, and we had a real space race. And let me make a few comments about Kennedy in space. And this isn't to denigrate him, this is to put it in the right perspective. There's always been a lot of hype about Kennedy's interest in space, you know, in the space program, and Apollo in particular. And there's no doubt he had a deep commitment, a political will to do this. But privately, he was not a real visionary. You know, despite what you might think, he was not a real visionary with regard to space. He was, contrary to popular belief, not a space cadet. He tried all the time when Apollo was going on and he was still alive to try and get Nikita Khrushchev to agree to a joint program. And Nikita Khrushchev would never do it. He just enjoyed rubbing the United States' nose in it too much to give that up. And he loved bragging about the superiority of the Soviet system. And so here's a few quotes from a tape recording when Kennedy was talking to James Webb, who was the NASA administrator at the time. Quote, this is whether we like it or not, a race. Everything we do in space ought to be tied into getting to the moon ahead of the Russians. Winning the moon race is the top priority of the agency. He meant NASA. So you see, Kennedy had the will to do it. That was the will to do it, and he decided it was going to get done. His science advisors were adamant not to do it. Eisenhower said it was ill-advised to do something just based on prestige. So there's one thing I ought to say in the process of doing this. Kennedy's advisors just did not want him to do this, and they felt that these are science advisors. He had them. There was no scientific benefit to doing it with a man. You could get the same thing out of robots. So they were advising him not to initiate this. And he relented and gave up to them in a certain way. He agreed not to call it a science research project. It was always referred to as an exploration program. And you'll see it as NASA, the Apollo exploration. It's never NASA science. There was no science. Kennedy did not call it that to appease his advisors. They never liked the program. Most of the science community didn't like the program because it took a lot of money away from them. And but we went ahead with it, and he had the will to do it, and that's what it took. I'm not going to cover too much of this in the interest of time. The X-15 did play a role in it because of it flew in near space, and it was the first pilot, Joe Walker, got up to about 67 miles. He could see the curvature of Earth and get a little weightlessness. So he really qualified for astronauts' wings. Neil Armstrong did the same thing. Neil Armstrong became an astronaut before he ever joined NASA, so because he flew the X-15. And the way that the X-15 was tracked across the country kind of became the model for mission control, a lot of the things that went on. Now, there were several really, really important key decisions made in the Apollo program that really made the lunar landing possible. First one was the F-1 engine. The United States Air Force, before NASA was ever created, had contracted with Rocket 9 to develop a rocket engine of a range between 1 million and 1.5 million pounds. That was a big, big rocket for the time. When NASA became official in October of 1958, we moved the engine development program of the F-1 over to NASA. They immediately started contracting with Rocket 9. NASA, because they could see the utility to it and the need for it, requested what's known as DX priority in the government. DX means anything you ask for, you get. I mean, if you want a pound of gold out of Fort Knox and you need it for the Apollo program, you get it. Basically, they did. The gold foil on the lunar module was because we extracted gold from Fort Knox. No problem, we got it. So the F-1 engine had the DX priority, and most of Apollo did too. It was the most powerful liquid rocket fuel ever built. And Rocketdyne came up with a lot of unique capabilities for it. They found a way of using the kerosene fuel to power the turbo pump, and that made it pretty efficient. And the turbo pump became so efficient that you didn't need to have high pressure in the fuel tanks and oxygen tanks, so you could reduce the weight. Weight, again, once again, is the key. In the end of 1961, they kept talking about what's the configuration for the booster for the moon. They decided on what Saturn V would look like. And I think at this time, if I remember, it only had 4 engines in the first stage, 6 million pounds of thrust. But von Braun always hated that big hole in the middle. Just didn't like it, just didn't look right. So he proposed adding the 5th one. There wouldn't be any problem. We did. So we ended up with 5 engines in the first time. And there's a lot of advantages to doing it with only 5 engines. It avoided that big cluster of 30 engines that the Russians used and all the complexities associated with everything involved with trying to ignite 32 engines that would all work perfectly. Also, it was much more reliable to use for fewer engines with fewer parts. It's just that simple. So that's how the F1 came about. Now the next one, which is probably even more important, was the J2 engine, what we call hydrogen technology. And this is probably one of the most important decisions made for the whole Apollo program and essentially enabled the whole thing to happen. It was done by a man by the name of Abe Silverstein, who had been brought to NASA headquarters from the Lewis Research Center in Cleveland to be an associate administrator. Well, this research center in Cleveland, Lewis, did a lot of engine testing. And so Abe Silverstein and his staff had been working on liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen engines. And there was one under development by Pratt & Whitney, which was not going too well. Now, it has been known since the early 1900s, probably late 20th century, 19th century, that the most power you're going to get out of a liquid-fueled engine is going to be using hydrogen and oxygen. But it is extremely difficult to do. And Abe Silverstein, studying it, came up with the fact that it would make for the simplest booster you could come up with if we use liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen engines. So he decreed from NASA headquarters that the Saturn II and the S4B would be liquid hydrogen. They would be used liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen engines. They selected Rocketdyne to build them. Nobody had ever built one before. And without that breakthrough in the J2 engine, it's doubtful the United States would have ever reached the moon. The other thing is that when the Russians looked at this, they had looked at the same thing. Everybody that's built the rocket looked at hydrogen and oxygen. The Russians were convinced it was so difficult, it would never happen. It was their leg up. They felt like they would beat the Americans because that would be the point that they would fail. They made a big mistake because it went well for the engine. And that J2 engine in the S4B was also unique in another way. It had to restart twice, okay? So it had to start to get you in orbit, and it had to restart to get you out of Earth orbit on your way to the moon. And a restarted rocket was new in those days. It was not that simple to do. Well, you've obviously seen this. Let me recap for you exactly what Saturn V looked like. It had 3 stages. It's about 363 feet tall. You lay it on end. You got the length of a football field with both end zones, and it was critical. You wouldn't have made it to the moon without it. There's no doubt about it. It weighed 6,423 pounds, of which 90% of it was propellant. The amazing thing about it, you look at it, a huge rocket with 3 stages, all new, lots of new technology. It had 13 launches, 9 of them went to the moon, all of them were successful. Saturn V never had a failure, and that's amazing in itself. The Russians had boosters bigger than this. The N1 was bigger than this, it had more rockets on it. They had 4 of them, every one of them blew up. They never had a successful flight. The S1C was the 5 F1 engine, 7.5 million pounds of thrust in the first stage. And that's why when you see the movie, if they're doing it in real time, you'll see the Saturn just barely moving. It looks like it's never going to get off the ground. That's because 7.5 million pounds is trying to lift up 6.4, and that's a thrust to weight that's pretty low. So until it starts using a lot more propellant, it starts accelerating. It's kind of scary. It looks like, oh, it's not going to make it. It kind of scares you at times. The S2, the Saturn II, it had 5 200,000-pound J2s, 1 million pounds of thrust, liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. The big problem with the upper stages was how you build the tanks. The ability to, and the S2 had a terrible time of the bulkhead between the two cryogenic propellants. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen boil at extremely low temperatures. Liquid hydrogen is something below 400 degrees below zero, and liquid oxygen about 320 degrees below zero. To create a bulkhead between them was a problem. It drove them crazy. So the tank for the S2 was the big problem. It was a bigger problem than the engines. The same way with the Saturn IVB. Once again, how do you store the propellants? It had one 200,000-pound engine, throttleable. Well, not throttleable. It was restartable, and that was amazing. Well, another interesting technology we used was the fuel cells. And the Apollo spacecraft didn't use solar cells. It couldn't, because if you had these big solar cells hanging out there and you fired the big engine to get a little more thrust to do something, you'd have to beef up the spacecraft so big so you didn't rip them off, or else you'd have to fold them back, and that was a mechanism. It just wasn't worth doing it. It would just cause too many problems. So solar panels were out. The fuel cell's really a pretty simple device. It just uses a combination of combining two chemicals, liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. They come together, they create two things. They create electrons, and in this case, these fuel cells could produce about 1 kilowatt of energy, and they produce distilled water. And I drank the water. It's very, very good water. In fact, they drank so much water that we had to throw it overboard. We couldn't carry it all. And so they always worked very well. Part of the problem with them was that they're only about 70% efficient. So they generated a lot of heat. So when you look at the service module, you'll see these little radiators, 8 of them wrapped around the service module. That's for rejecting the heat out of the fuel cells. And the other big radiators are for rejecting the heat out of the command module. All the electronics in the command module generate a lot of heat. In fact, they generate so much heat, we put them on cold plates. And we had to pull the heat out, run it through a radiator, eject it, the heat, and cycle it back. But one of the interesting things about the fuel cells that I just really love is the storage tanks. I have pictures of them, I don't use them here. They're spherical, 2 tanks, hydrogen and oxygen, that held the cryogenics. And except for the explosion that we had in Apollo 13, where there was a flaw inside the hydrogen tank, they never failed. The fuel cells operated absolutely perfectly. And the fuel tanks are just a masterpiece. I think they were built by Ball here in as I remember, Ball here in Colorado. They did a marvelous job. Let me give you an example of how good they were. If you were to take the Apollo liquid hydrogen tank for the fuel cells, fill it up with ice, put it in a room at 70 degrees, it would take 8.5 years to melt the ice. Likewise, if you just look at the leakage rate of those tanks, if you had an automobile tire leaking at the same rate as an Apollo cryogenic tank for the fuel cells, it would go flat in 30 million years. They were that good. Amazing piece of technology. Well, I'm not going to cover too much on the lunar module. Just a few things. You've seen a lot about it. The lunar module, well, let me go back a minute. I got to hit the mode decision first. This also was the most critical decision you could make. We've known about it since the feasibility study. How do you get to the moon? That's the catch. There were 3 ways you could do it. One we call direct descent. That's just the brute force method. You're going to get something with 9 million pounds of thrust, 4 stages, and it's just going to blast it straight to the moon. And that's a lot of problems. It's a big vehicle, lots of problems, lots of parts. We weren't too crazy about that. Earth orbit rendezvous, looked like the way to do it, and what you did is you launched all the parts into an Earth orbit, assembled them, and then fired them off to the moon. That was the one that von Braun liked. Well, for a couple reasons. First of all, he used a lot of rockets that he built at the Manned Spacecraft and Marshall Spacecraft Center. He liked that, gave them a lot of work. But the other reason was, and he called it, you know, it was the way of the future. If you could build a way to build up spacecraft in Earth, you could go to anywhere in the universe. He did not like the lunar orbit rendezvous. Lunar orbit rendezvous was a dead end, he said, and he was right. Once you did that, you're stuck with it. It's one thing, one shot going to the moon. It has no expansion capability to go on to Mars or anywhere else. So von Braun always considered it a dead end, and he was never crazy about it. Where it originated was from a guy at Langley Research Center who was not an engineer. He was the head of the theoretical physics department. He got a memo from somebody that was calculating trajectories, that it looked like this was a nice way to do it with a lunar orbit rendezvous. He ran some calculations, ran the weights, looked at it, and he became a zealot for lunar orbit rendezvous. He took it to the Manned Spacecraft Center, and they looked at it, didn't think the weights were right, looked at it, and they were not crazy about it either, but not so much, I think, because it wasn't a good idea. In fact, the idea is too good to be true. Is because it was proposed by a guy that didn't have any experience whatsoever. The guy sitting behind a desk with a slide rule. You know, what the hell does he know about space? You know, so they were kind of against it for a while. Then all of a sudden, as it became obvious they were not going to get to the moon any other way, this was the cheapest, lightest weight, fastest way to do it. The Manned Spacecraft Center, the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office, became the ones that had to sell it. So we created a group under the guy that was he was the head of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office program at the time, Charlie Frick, got a guy by the name of Bill Rector, the guy whose picture you saw standing next to the feasibility study, to create what we call Charlie Frick's Roadshow. And we went through several months of the roadshow, going to everywhere, trying to sell all of NASA on lunar orbit rendezvous. It finally ended up in some whopping meeting in Huntsville at what von Braun's building we used to call the von Braun Hilton, and it went on for a whole day with Manned Spacecraft Center, the Apollo Program Office, presenting all the benefits. This is the way we had to do it. The Marshall Spacecraft Center guys under von Braun saying, no, this is not the way to do it. That went on. I think that meeting lasted 8 or 10 hours. Finally, right at the end, von Braun pulls a piece of paper out of his pocket and reads from it with some words that essentially ends up to say, this center will support lunar orbit rendezvous, and walks out. All of his staff is amazed. Never told them any way he was going to do that. We think the reason he did that is von Braun was a very practical guy, and he knew that that was the only way we were going to get Kennedy's deadline. So he just gave in to the schedule thing. And I think there's a lot of backseat talk about some things we'll do for Marshall to keep it going, that kind of thing. So he agreed to do it. That put lunar orbit rendezvous in as the mode to do it. And in 1962, after that, the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office presented all the data to NASA headquarters. And in July of 1962, headquarters decided that that was going to be the way we were going to go to the moon. Kennedy's science advisors went ballistic. It was considered a very, very risky maneuver thing. We didn't look at it quite that way, but the science advisors, because they conceived it as being so risky, did not want to have a failure on John F. Kennedy's watch. So they were violently opposed to this, and it took lots of meetings to get around it. Finally, Kennedy just said, that's the way we're going to do it. That's it. And that's how it came about. Once we had lunar orbit rendezvous defined, you now had the lunar spacecraft. We now had a spacecraft that we could take to the moon. There was no arguments about configuration anymore. We know what it was going to be. So we had the lunar module, ascent and descent stages. One thing I'd say, a piece of advanced technology, The descent stage had to be a throttleable engine so you could vary the thrust as you were coming down. It was a hypergolic engine. All the engines in the Apollo spacecraft, lunar module and command module, were hypergolic. No turbo pumps, you didn't want that intricacy, and so you wanted to keep going with it. So that's the way we did it. Here's a little, let me go through this. I'm going to get the hook here in a minute. That's what a mission looked like. You've seen that. Gemini was the big contributor. Paul Guidance Computer was the most amazing machine you'd ever see. It was unbelievable in what it could do. And when people talk about I went to the moon with a computer that had less power than my watch, they're actually right. But that misses the point. The point is it was one computer, okay? If you fly on a commercial airliner, it has 3. And the orbiter had 5. So that was what's amazing about it. And you can, the way it was designed. There you see how with the core memory was a bunch of magnetic cores with little fine wires wrapped around them that gave you zeros and ones. We woven in there by what we called little old ladies. LOLs, not very politically correct nowadays, but nobody minded in those days. The other thing I should tell you about is the heat shield. The heat shield was also unique. It was a fiberglass aluminum honeycomb with several 100,000 cells in it, varied from 2 inches thick at the thick end to about a ½ inch at the thin. Every single one of those cells was injected with a little gun to make sure it was perfect with a phenolic resin. They'd x-ray it, it had the slightest gap in it, they cored it out, started over again. And it slid over the pressure vessel in the command module. With the reliability challenge was obviously something we had to do in the way we designed hardware. So, let me see, let me go here. Apollo 7 was the vehicle that was successful beyond anybody's doubt. You don't see much about it, and you never will. In a lot of the movies you see, it's kind of given a short stroke. It took 18 months to build an almost perfect spacecraft that had about 20 minor problems, mostly with instrumentation. The reason you don't see it is because there was a big argument between the flight crew and mission control. I don't even know if Gene will really talk about it. We didn't like it. As a result of that, that crew would never fly in another vehicle. Wally Schirra already announced he was going to retire, but the other 2 guys never flew again. Chris Kraft told him, "You will never fly." It made the circumlunar mission possible, which is interesting. We know that. There you go back. Are we going to return to the moon? That's a question I get asked all the time. And the answer is, you're going to do it with an astronaut. The answer is probably no, or very slim or none. You know, Apollo was an anomaly. It was a unique set of circumstances that came together at a unique time and with unique things that happened. We had the resources and technology, we had that then. We had the will to do it, we'd do that. Does anybody in this room really believe that you can get a Congress now to vote almost unanimously to send somebody to the moon? It's impossible. It's not going to happen. There won't be a will to do it. So if you're going to do it, it's going to be sort of a slow, drawn-out thing within NASA's meager budget, which might take years to do. So that's the problem with going back to the moon. Well, here's the other problem, which is not very well known. At the end of the Apollo program, Senator William Proxmire, Democrat from Wisconsin, had legislation passed that killed the Saturn V. And when I mean killed, he just didn't kill missions. The legislation said you will destroy the hardware, the tooling, the drawings, and whatever spacecraft are there. The Saturn V today does not exist. You could not build it again. There's no tooling, there's no drawings, there's nothing. Proxmire was effective enough to get that killed. I don't know exactly how, but they did kill it. Von Braun said it was the stupidest thing the United States ever did. Well, let me just conclude with this. Carl Sagan, and a lot of you heard Carl Sagan speak, could wax eloquently as only he could about living at the perfect time. And he made this statement: In all the history of mankind, there will be only one generation which will be the first to explore the solar system, one generation for which in childhood planets are distant and indistinct disks moving through the night, and for which old age and the planets are places, diverse new worlds in the course of exploration. He was really right. And I'm blessed to have been there at the right time, at the right place. I was one of those 400,000 people that played a role in getting us there, and I'm damn proud of it. Well, I had to see it living black and white, but it was one heck of a journey. And I think I lived at the perfect time, participated in it in the perfect way. And with that, I'll close. I don't know, we have any time for questions, or you want to?